When considering whether to use daycare as an option for childcare for your child as a woman, I think that there are a lot of considerations that need to be made. As someone who is pregnant with my first child, and also as someone who has worked in a daycare in the past, and has looked into several studies that have been coming out regarding daycare and the dangers that some of them do pose. I think so many women nowadays feel very conflicted between these two options of going back to work or choosing to stay home once they have children. And I think for many women, they feel backed into a corner because of finances, generally speaking, or because maybe they have a husband that desires that they go back to work, even if it's not financially necessary. And so there are a lot of women out there who feel like their only option is to go back to work after they have their sweet baby, and that they don't have another option. Now, there are also women out there who very much have been wanting to have a career in a certain topic, like say it's teaching or nursing or whatever that might be. And because they've become so passionate about that topic, when they're pregnant, they do naturally assume that they will just be able to go right back to that job just the way that they left it and just stick their kid in daycare like everyone else does and just continue onwards with no retribution or guilt. I think what a lot of women don't realize is, just from a statistical point of view, many women, when they give birth, specifically not at the point at which they're pregnant, though that is a great deal of bonding that happens with baby, but especially when women go and they give birth to that child and that child is put on their chest and they see their own child for the first time, many women have this conflict within them that is very natural. It's actually biological. Your body is literally producing a ton of hormones that tell you, keep this child near you, start raising this child, be around this child as much as you can. It encourages quality time spent with a young baby, even when it's very difficult, even when it's very hard. A majority of mothers will feel very connected to and wanting to protect their child. I'm just going to give a quick pause here to remind you to go ahead and click that subscribe button if you're enjoying what you're hearing. I talk about living an intentional life rooted in God's word, and so we talk a lot about mindsets that we can have that are going to be beneficial to bringing about a better, more structured and well-run society. Because this is the case, there are a lot of women who feel very real guilt for dropping their children off, especially at a daycare. I think that so often we live in a culture that encourages people that if you feel any sort of guilt, it must be something that is wrong with you, that you should never feel any sort of guilt for any decision that you make, no matter whether it's a better decision or not. It's just a neutral option that anyone can have. And so many women will feel very pressured by society to suppress any sort of guilt that they ever feel about maybe leaving their baby with someone else, because society has told them that guilt should not have a place in their life, that there's never a reason behind why they should feel guilty, that guilt inherently is just a societal pressure that's placed on people rather than an inherent reality and feeling of conscience that we all have. Because of this, many women for many years stuff down the feeling of guilt that they have at dropping their young children, especially babies, off at a daycare and moving to go to a work environment that is spending 8 hours a day, and they say to themselves what culture has told them to say, which is, I'll spend quality time with them when I get home. I will, I'll just focus really hard on them once I am at home. But then at these 8 hours that I get to go to work, like, it doesn't matter. It's just what I should do. Society encourages me to do it. That's what daycare centers are for. They can take just as good of care of my child as I can. And that's what we are encouraged to do. The problem with that is, well, twofold. The first issue with that, I'm not going to go as deeply into, but the first issue with that is just the inherent desires. It takes away from our natural state of being. So naturally, we feel guilt because of our conscience. And so guilt is actually an inherent feeling that we can have, whether or not society says something one way or the other. So for instance, even when society is saying something totally opposite, if you do a totally opposite thing that is inherent and against your own nature, you will still feel guilty because that is your conscience telling you that you are guilty. Our consciences are there to remind us of a specific truth and to kind of show us what a better way, a better alternative is. That's why people do feel guilty. Now, quote unquote, shame, I guess, could come from outside. So from other people, they can then shame you for whatever decision you make, either this way or that way. So that's more of an external aggression. So that's kind of the first issue that is with this perspective of, oh, well, you should just be able to stuff your guilt down and not care. Now, with that being said, I think that guilt can be stuffed down. Our conscience can be suppressed to the point at which it no longer needs suppressing. So if we have continually told ourselves something enough times, suppress the guilt that we feel, suppressed it, our conscience eventually comes to a point at which it will no longer bring up that form of guilt because we have suppressed it to that extreme. In this case of women, many women, like I said, feel very guilty bringing their kids and just leaving them for hours upon hours of the day because this isn't something that has been done throughout centuries. Even when women did work, they would work outside the home, they'd tie their baby around their chest. Like, their babies were not in this separate area of society. They were just a part of everything. Like, that has been what has been natural for years, and we have seen how that plays out. A lot of women are told, okay, suppress this guilt once you feel it. You're going to feel it, but you're just going to suppress it. You're going to do what you want to do, what you think is best for your situation, whether or not you feel any sort of guilt or any sort of whatever. The second thing that is so wrong with this is when we tell people consistently to suppress how they naturally feel, a lot of mothers then who truly are in a situation in which they literally have no other options other than to maybe send their kids to daycare or to have someone else besides them with their children, we are then teaching them that their situation is the same as other women's situation. So for a situation in which a woman genuinely feels like there is no other option than that she has to go to work. Like, for instance, in the case of a single mother where she maybe got pregnant out of wedlock, she isn't married, the man left her, and she is solely responsible for this child. In that case, she hasn't any other options at the point other than to drop them off, her children, and go to work because she literally has to be the provider in this scenario and setting. Now, ideally, there would be people surrounding her with love. There would be people who would be able to help with her provision that she would maybe be able to live with, that they would be able to take shifts, or that there would be some sort of community, but that's not the case in all of these situations. And so there is a spot for her to be able to put her child into daycare. However, we have equated that situation with the same situation of mothers who just feel guilty because they choose to go back to work for 8 hours a day just because that's what they want to do. And I think the issue here is that we need to start acknowledging that there is an ideal, that ideally mothers are not meant or created to inherently be separated from their young infants until that child is slowly growing and developing independence and starting to grow and then explore out into the world. And then, there's a lot more independence as they grow older. But when we equate everyone's situations and make it seem like it's exactly the same, we don't give nuance for the fact that there is an ideal, that ideally mothers should be with their young babies for many years. And so the problem is, especially in that first 3 years of life, more specifically. And so the problem is there's a lot of these mothers who are being told by the culture and by the media, maybe by people at work, that it's better for them. It's better for their children to be in this daycare setting rather than to be loved by their mother and taken care of by their mother. And in many cases, what's happening is not only are they encouraging that daycare is a better option than that, but that there's no options in between daycare and stay-at-home mom. And I think that this is so detrimental because there are so many ways in which daycare can be avoided or at least minimized for many women who maybe they don't have a quite as ideal situation, but there are other options in between. And so many of those other options are a group nanny, an in-home daycare instead of an industrialized daycare. Any sort of relative watching a baby is going to be someone that's consistent in their life, is going to be a much better alternative than an industrialized daycare, than even an in-home daycare, than even a group nanny. That's still going to be much better. Dr. Erica Comazar talks about these ideals as well. So I would encourage you to check out her work. She is a therapist, I believe, perhaps a psychoanalyst. I'm not totally sure. However, there are a lot of options in between. Like the first ideal is mother and baby. The second most ideal is the father and the baby. And then after that, it is, like a relative. And then if you can't do a relative, then a nanny. If you can't do a nanny, then a group nanny, which is where like several families hire the same nanny. And so it's still very individualized and personalized to your child. They have a similar person that they're growing up with, an emotional support character in their life, but it's not necessarily someone who they're watching 10 children at once. And then after all of those options, then an in-home daycare, and then industrialized, just stereotypical daycare that you send your kids to. So I think that we need to start waking up and realizing that there are so many more options in between I can't do this or I can do this, like stay-at-home mom or daycare center. There's even the option of working part-time or adjusting in that way, like finding a way that both the husband and the wife like work part-time, and maybe the husband can stay with the child when the wife works part-time if they really, really need that extra income that the wife makes. At the end of the day, I hope that we can all agree that daycare is not an ideal, that there are a lot of problems with the ratios that most daycares have, that it's not ideal for children to be in such a large industrialized setting. when they are so very young, so like babies to maybe 1-2 years old, most especially, and that as they grow older, children's needs change and that they grow and develop accordingly, but that there are ways that we can minimize the impacts that daycare has. And if we start minimizing daycares and maybe have, in some cases, people moving to having nannies in their household, or some women moving to part-time jobs so that way they still can be home with their children for a bigger chunk of time, or finding ways in which they can avoid the daycare scene and create a more ideal, maybe not the most ideal, but a more ideal situation and setting for their children and for their family. As someone who worked in a daycare, I saw even a very well-run, very nice daycare, you can see the difference between the way that daycare students react, how they are raised. You can tell that it's very much that they are a part of a number. They're a part of this industrialized system, and they're not necessarily viewed as an individual child with individual needs. And there's a lot of things that even daycare workers can't do just legally from a perspective that a mother is able to. Like even just breastfeeding, like a mother can breastfeed her child, and no one at daycare is going to be able to do that. And so they're not going to get that oxytocin increase from that. Now, that doesn't not mean that everyone can breastfeed their child. That does not mean that there's not a place for formula or not a place for pumping. But we can acknowledge that there is an ideal in this situation while still agreeing that you're choosing what is most ideal for your family within that better ideal. I think if we can decrease a lot of these daycare numbers, it will help the actual daycares to function better because they'll have less kids in the daycare system to be working with daycare. So then, the ratios will be lower. Daycare will be a better experience. There will be less neglect in those cases because of the lower numbers, because less people are utilizing daycare. If any of these thoughts resonated with you, please comment below. I appreciate you watching this video, and I would love it if you give it a thumbs up. That will really help push this information out to more people.